I would also be the first to recognize that our continent still faces tremendous challenges, because many of us recognize that Africa is not yet operating at its full potential, and that Africa is not making the contribution that it could make to the global community of the world. And these challenges are easily discernible. They're easy to identify. I would cite a couple of them to launch our conversation. The first challenge that I see on the African continent is the lack of political will. It is difficult to put in place democratic institutions without people who believe in democracy, without democrats. And I think that our continent, in the last 2 decades, even as we have struggled to put in place democratic institutions, has been dealing with individuals who are an inheritance of either military rule or the one-party state. And so you now have a number of leaders who are former military officers who, with the wave of democratization, in order not to be swept aside, immediately transformed themselves into civilian leaders, took off the uniform, and contested elections, and either won or in some cases declared themselves winners. And so these individuals are not Democrats at heart. And while the language, the rhetoric about democracy may be commonplace, they still are unwilling or still do not demonstrate the political will to really put in place full-fledged functioning democratic societies. That's what explains the difference, for example, between the progress that a country like Benin has made compared to the lack of progress that a country like Togo has experienced. That explains, for example, why Ghana has done and has been doing very well compared to its neighbor of Cote d'Ivoire. That explains, for example, why Mali is doing well, despite being in the same vicinity, neighborhood, as Niger, that is now stumbling. That explains why South Africa has been able to go through its national reconciliation process and continues to do well as a functioning democracy, compared to Zimbabwe, which a few years or a few decades ago looked like it was the breadbasket of Southern Africa, and is today a country in which people, millions of citizens, are seeking refuge in neighboring countries in the Southern Africa region. That explains why Mozambique, for example, a country that had known conflict for many decades, has been doing very well. And the social indicators, on human development in Mozambique continue to look up compared to a country like Angola that has tremendous resources, but in which the gap between the wealthy and the rest of the citizens, or the not so wealthy, continues to grow. A country that has half of the country full of diamonds and the other half full of oil, but in which poverty is still the top of the day for the vast majority of its citizens. So the absence of political will, for me, is one of the major challenges that the African continent faces. The second challenge that I see on the continent has to do with the non-compliance with norms of good governance and standards of good governance. And these are norms that African countries and African governments have adopted themselves. For example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which provides that citizens have a right to choose their leaders through credible elections organized on a regular basis. You would find in the constitution of almost every African country that is reference in the preambles of these constitutions to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which means that these governments have adhered to these international norms. Unfortunately, the practice doesn't reflect the commitment that has been made on paper. When you look at African countries and you read through African constitutions, you have some of the best rated constitutions, but it's always the implementation that is lacking. It is what some authors in the academic community refer to as constitutions without constitutionalism, where countries and governments use constitutions to eliminate their opponents or shrink political space, rather than use constitutions to guarantee the rights of citizens and create an environment in which citizens can perform in their best potential. That explains why even the organization, the continental organization, the African Union, has the propensity to come up with wonderful resolutions, but doesn't have the courage to make sure that those resolutions are implemented by every African country. That was what contributed to the collapse of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, which was the organization that preceded the African Union. And the concern that many of us have today is that if the African Union doesn't show more muscle in making sure that its resolutions are implemented, that sooner or later the younger generation of Africans would lose faith in that regional body the way they did with the Organization of African Unity. Because of this question of constitutions without constitutionalism, we find that there's an absence of checks and balances in many of our countries. There's an over-concentration of political power within the executive branch, which centers around one individual, and a weakness of institutions such as parliaments that should exercise oversight over the executive branch of government, or that should represent citizen interests, and also legislate in a way that can create the right framework for human development and economic development in many of our countries. We also find that the judiciary in some countries is not as independent as ought to be because it's manipulated by the executive. And with that level of concentration of power, it's extremely difficult to have development take place. We also have issues with regards to security sector reform, that in a lot of these countries, the militaries that were inherited at independence have continued to grow as institutions, but have not been shaped in a way that should respond to the present threats that these countries face. The threat in Africa today is not a threat of an invasion from some external force. The threat in Africa today with regards to security is a question of human security. And if African governments cannot guarantee to their citizens a feeling of security in their daily well-being, then African governments will have failed in that responsibility, and serious thought needs to be given to security sector reform.